I have a very strange family. Most would say the same about their own, but mine is much different. My family is very old. We descend from a long line that originated in a deep recess of the Balkans, where legends of Strigoi and Dompiers were given life centuries ago. My family is very close and extremely large. Over the years, I've heard many bizarre stories from the old country, and even more bizarre accounts of the old ways. You see, traditionally, legal issues and disputes were dealt with by families independently. There were no police to intervene, and it was unheard of to discuss family affairs with anyone who wasn't blood. The strangest story I heard was about an archaic practice known as revendicare finala, or final claim. The strange practice centered around the final wish of the deceased to be buried with all of their worldly belongings. Literally everything from money to furniture, clothing, and pictures. It's even been rumored that pets have been buried alive with their owners. I know little else about the practice except that it has not been invoked in over 150 years. I never gave it much thought until recently. My family gathers regularly. I have countless uncles, aunts, and cousins. So many, in fact, that I forget some of their names from time to time. We are headed by my family's matriarch, my great-grandmother, Daciana. She's an astonishing 107 years old, but you could easily guess it from looking at her. Her pale white skin drapes off her bones. She always wears far too much makeup, which adds to her gaunt appearance. She's a very bitter old woman, and most of the family merely tolerates her because of her position. She is also vastly wealthy, but you would never know it from looking at her home. She is a hoarder, and the rooms of her large home are filled to the brim with everything from expensive baubles to worthless knickknacks. But through all of her vitriolic nature, she has always had a strange fondness for me. Not one you would describe necessarily as loving, but more possessive, as though I were part of her endless collection. She always used to tell me that I was hers forever. It always left me unsettled. As the years passed, my grandmother's great age began to finally catch up with her, and her health started to wane. It wasn't long until she passed away. Months after we interred her in a large and extremely ornate tomb, we were called together to hear a last will and testament that she had written a decade earlier, and had been lost until now. We gathered in her lawyer's office, who of course, ironically, was one of my older and distant cousins. He read the will, exactly as she wrote it, in a very old and somewhat indistinguishable Romani dialect. I and other younger members of my family could scarcely understand what my cousin was saying, but from the looks on the faces of my older family members, I knew what he was saying was not good. They began to get very angry as he babbled on, until he said something that I finally did recognize. Revendicare finala. My grandmother had actually invoked the right of final claim. It wasn't long before I and some of my other younger cousins were hurriedly rushed out of the office, and the door was slammed behind us. I leaned in to try to hear the conversation, but I could have stood on the other side of the room and still would have heard it as clearly as if I was standing next to them. They were angry about something. Very angry. But they were all speaking in that damn Romani, and I could not understand what they were saying. Suddenly, the door to the office burst open and my mother and father rushed out. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably. Whatever had been said had greatly upset the both of them. Later that night, I was beginning to doze off in my small student apartment when I heard noise coming from the front door. It sounded like someone was trying to break into my home. Cautiously and with an understandable amount of fear, I rose from my bed, grabbed a bat, and made my way towards the door to investigate. As I got closer, I realized the door was wide open, and I heard a noise coming from behind me. Before I could turn and react, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, and everything went black. I dreamt that my parents were standing over me, weeping, telling me they were sorry and saying they had no choice. I heard a scuffing sound and then a loud bang. When I finally did wake up, I was still surrounded by darkness, but my nose was filled by a pungent aroma which I had never smelled before. Instantly, I felt the need to vomit, but when I tried to sit up, my head cracked painfully off a very hard surface. It was stone. I lifted my legs and I moved my arms, and it wasn't long before I realized that I was in a box. A stone box. And something was in the box with me. A feeling of intense dread began to creep into my mind as the horror of my realization told me the truth of my plight before I'd even discovered it for myself. My hand shook as it reached into my pocket to retrieve my Zippo lighter. I struck the flint. With a bright flash, my nightmare was shown to me in vivid yellow hues. I was right. I was in a stone box. A crypt. And as I turned my head to see my fellow inhabitant, I screamed in agonizing terror. Because there, laying next to me, was the rotting and putrid remains of my great-grandmother. Her lidless eyes sunk deep in their hollow sockets, and the flesh round her mouth recessed away into a macabre grin. Maggots had found their way into the crypt and were slowly feasting upon her bloated corpse. I kicked and I clawed at the lid, desperate to get out, but it was no use. Stone would not budge. I stopped screaming long enough to finally put all the facts together. I knew now what they argued about in my cousin's office and why my mother fled in tears. I knew now who had broken into my apartment. And I knew the visage of my parents begging forgiveness was no dream. My grandmother had indeed claimed final right, but it wasn't her trinkets that she wanted laid to rest alongside of her. It was me. The unending horror still gripped me as the minutes turned to hours. My lighter had failed long ago, and now I was alone in the black. Alone, except for her. I could feel the air getting heavier as the oxygen began to run out. Maybe it was that loss of oxygen, or maybe it was the madness which had now seized my mind, but I swear to you, in my final moments, that I heard her next to me, laughing, telling me that I was finally hers, forever.